One concern is that what's going on in a country like the United States is that we're getting a lot of growth at the top end for those, in the top 20% or 10% in terms of jobs, and a lot of growth at the bottom end, at the bottom quintile. And so in some ways we may have sort of a missing middle, a hollowing out of the middle class. And we have seen that some of it has been good, where we've had people who, were in the middle class that have moved up to higher income jobs. But we haven't seen a lot of people from the bottom moving up as well. And so that's one of the concerns. This graph just shows the expected job growth in terms of number of employees over the next 10 years, well, from 2014 to 2024. And you can see there's a lot of job growth at the bottom, and there's a fair amount of job growth at the top, with less job growth in the middle. The other big problem in terms of inequality is uh, categorical inequality or group inequality. And so what we often see is that different groups within a country will earn less. And so that could be based on gender, right? So we often see that women earn less than men for similar levels of education. It could be based on race or ethnicity. So, black people earn less than white people in the United States for similar levels of education. It could be just country of citizenship. It could be that immigrants earn less than native-born workers. So this graph shows the difference between male and female earnings at different levels of education. So that's another area that we want to focus on when we're talking about inequality within a country. The other main issue with inequality is the idea that inequality gets passed from one generation to the next, and we often call this intergenerational inequality. And so the idea here is that someone who is born poor may have less of a chance to move up and become middle class or rich than someone who is born middle class or born rich. And so, intergenerational transmission, the reason for this could take a lot of forms, right? It could be that, people inherit their parents' wealth, so that gives them a start in terms of their economic success. It could be genetics, it could be culture or traits. And so there's a lot of possibility for intergenerational inequality. But for a country like the United States that prides itself on the American dream, we would like to make sure that everybody has an equal chance of success. And so the intergenerational elasticity measures, how much a parent's economic success gets transferred to their children. And so when that number is high, we have low intergenerational mobility. So here is an example from both the United States and Denmark. And you can imagine we have, 5 different quintiles going from the poorest 20% to the richest 20%. And we can see, for children born in each of those quintiles, where they end up as adults. So this just looks at the poorest 20% and the richest 20% for the US and Denmark. And you can see that if you're born in the poorest 20%, you have a 40% chance of staying in the poorest 20% and only a 7.4% chance of making it to the richest. Whereas if you're born in the richest 20%, you have a 36% chance of staying in the richest 20% and a 9.8% chance of falling down to the poorest. If we had complete intergenerational equality, we would expect those numbers all to be 0.2. I should also note that in the United States, there is a big difference between white families and black families. Black families experience this poverty trap much more significantly than do white families. In Denmark, we can see that their intergenerational inequality is much closer to the ideal, to that 0.2. If you're born in the poorest 20%, you only have a 25% chance of staying there, whereas you have a 16.7% chance of moving up. And if you're born in the richest 20%, you have a 34% chance of staying there and a 16.1% chance of moving down. So this shows that actually the United States has less intergenerational mobility, more intergenerational inequality than does a country like Denmark. And there seems to be a positive relationship between inequality cross-sectionally, so at one point in time, and inequality between generations. And there could be a number of reasons for that. So it could be that, societies that have a strong desire for fairness have policies that reduce that inequality. And there could also be, the effects of luck that are passed on through generations. And so, if wealth is passed on, if education is passed on through generations, then that will um, contribute to intergenerational inequality also. And we can graph this in what's often been called the Gatsby curve. And so we have intergenerational inequality on the horizontal axis. So countries over here have more intergenerational inequality, less mobility, and then cross-sectional inequality on the vertical axis. And you can see that, countries like Norway, Denmark, and Finland have both low cross-sectional inequality and intergenerational inequality, whereas countries like Italy, the US, and the UK have high in both. And there are some outliers. Switzerland has generally low cross-sectional inequality, but pretty high intergenerational inequality.